Hello and welcome. My name is Walid Mehr. I'm a Microsoft Technical Trainer here to walk through the Microsoft SC-300 Identity and Access Administrator Associate course with you. Think about the most sensitive resource in your organization: admin accounts, critical data, and privileged roles. What if you could ensure that only the right people have the elevated access only when they truly need it and with full visibility and control? That's the power of Privileged Identity Management, PIM, in Microsoft Entra. In this session, you will discover how PIM helps you manage, monitor, and protect privileged roles, reducing risk and supporting compliance so you can keep your organization secure without slowing down productivity. Let's jump onto the portal and start configuring PIM. So I'm back onto my Entra Admin Center on entra.microsoft.com, and under the blade, I am looking at Identity Governance, and we are right now at the Privileged Identity Management, or PIM in short. Now, under PIM, we have quite a few different areas that we can look into managing. So you can look into managing PIM for your Entra roles. You can look at managing PIM for your groups and Azure resources. Now, Azure Resource roles, we'll talk about all of this just in a minute. First of all, let's start with Entra roles to understand what PIM actually does for me and what I can manage within PIM. Now, if you've watched one of my earlier videos in this series, we speak about management of Entra. Within that, we go into admin roles and assigning roles to people. Now, ideally, when we look at Zero Trust and talk about giving least privilege access, we want to make sure that we are giving people the right amount of level of access they need to be able to perform their tasks. However, do we need this access to be provided for the duration that person works within the organization? Or do they only need this access maybe once every day or once every week or maybe 2-3 times in a day? You decide. So based on some of that, we're going to drill down a little bit more into just-in-time access along with just enough access. So if your user does require an access at an administrator level, maybe they can, but do we need them to be an administrator all the time, even when they're not carrying out administrative tasks? And this is where we want to start bringing in PIM in assigning the roles. Let's have a quick look at that. Now, during the setup of my PIM, I am currently looking at the roles that are currently available for me to look at. These are all the Entra roles that we have available to assign. If I quickly look at the overview of this, I can see currently there are quite a few different roles that are active in my environment. This means there are people who are already assigned these roles and they are working with these roles to them. However, we have another column here that says eligible. That tells me there are certain roles that are available for people that they can assign themselves this role to. That means they're eligible to become this role. Now, how do we set this all up? And that's what we're going to talk about as part of this session. Now, let's start with an assignment. First of all, I'm going to go on the top of my screen and click on assignments. Now, under assignment over here, this is very similar to if you were within your Entra assigning someone roles. However, we are now using Identity Governance and we're going through the PIM menu to assign the role to someone. Now, let's have a look at a role. Let's assume we're giving application administrator role and we're going to assign this to a user that we have, and the scope for this could be an application directly, it could be a service principal that we have, or we could be creating this for an entire directory that we have in our tenant. So I'll leave it as the entire directory for now. Now let's go and select a member, and this is where we bring our star user that we've been working with called Frank. We'll bring in Frank to assign this role and we'll say select. So we want to assign this role to Frank. Now, so far, nothing has changed in a sense that we could have done this in Entra under the admin and roles, but what's the difference? Well, when I jump onto the settings of this, I can see that I have the option here to make this eligible to this user, which means instead of permanently assigning this role to this user and making this active for all the time, I can say, hey, Frank, whenever you need to perform an administrative task to do with your applications, go in and request for this role, and you can be assigned this role. Once you're assigned this role, you can perform your task, and after you're done, this role can be released. Now, apart from that, I have also an option over here that suggests, is it going to be permanently eligible forever? Would this user be always eligible to request for this role? Now, that depends. If this person is only working for a particular project for a duration of time, you might want to go in here and change that. Typically, if I leave this permanently eligible, by default, this is eligible for at least 1 year. You can't extend that. You might need to go back and assign that eligibility again. But by default, this is for 1 year. You can't make it for longer. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to say leave this eligible and make them permanently eligible for it for a year, and we can hit assign. And this is how you can simply assign a role that somebody is eligible to. Now, just to understand a little bit more around this, all I'm going to do is go into my application administrator role to see what this all means. First of all, Frank's now added to the list. I can see Frank is now eligible to request for this role. Now, before we go into trying some of that, let's go into some details about the application administrator role. Now, if I go down into the role settings, just to understand exactly what's going on with this role, I can see there are some settings. These are by default settings. You can edit them, but just be aware, if you make a change to this will implement to every single user that has this role assigned to them. So just be careful on that. Now, I could go into editing some of this, saying, hey, once this role is active or during the activation maximum duration is number of hours. I can drop this down to half an hour, and I can take it all the way to 24 hours. Now, if I want this activation, for instance, every time a user requests for this, they will have 2 hours window. Within that 2 hours, they continue their work. If they're not done, they can request this activation again. So I can choose that in here. This is the just-in-time part. So when they're eligible, they request access to be that role. Once that time spans out, they go back to normal as a normal user. And they can request back to being an application administrator again by requesting this access. Now, to ensure that if this account falls into a malicious actor's hand, they don't exploit this particular feature, we can add some more details to this to ensure that if, as a malicious actor, I gain access to someone's account, first thing I would like to see is, are there any roles available for me to claim? And if there are some roles with privilege, maybe I can try them and try to go and explore a little bit more, or cause as much damage as I can, which I don't want to. So I don't want that to happen to my organization. What I can do here is then introduce other things. On activation, request user to go through MFA. Now, this is something that I can add in here. So if their account was compromised and someone is trying to gain access to this, they're still stopped. We're adding another hurdle for them just to jump to see if they are the actual user, can they go through the MFA and claim this role? Or we can go and add Microsoft Entra conditional access authentication context in here to ensure that they make sure they meet the minimum requirement to be able to request that role. Now, apart from that, if you look further down, we could also add another step in there to say required justification on activation. So they are providing details of the need for them to elevate their current rights or privileges to be able to perform this task or to be able to gain this role. You could also require a ticket information on activation. You could also add a require approval to activate. Now, again, this is a nice thing to add in a way where someone is going to approve your access to be able to perform tasks. But imagine you are the application administrator for your organization. For most of the time when you're doing different tasks, you don't need to be an administrator. However, as and when you need to do some administrative tasks, you elevate your role. Now, if you have to wait for an approval every so often for someone to do this, this is a lot of effort for you, and it can reduce productivity. So bear in mind, this is a good feature to add. Depending on the role and the need that you have, you might need to implement this or ignore this and add other methods to ensure the user can verify it's them trying to elevate themselves to an admin role. So for this, I'll just remove that for now. Under assignments, if I look at this, again, allow permanent eligibility assignments, which we did already for our role because it was available. It was already assigned for that role. And like I said, the maximum time you can do this is up to 1 year. That's the maximum time. Allow permanent active assignments. Again, this is something we can do. We can make someone an active for this role. And if we did that, again, the maximum assignment expiry can also go up to 1 year. But for my default setting, it's got 6 months enabled there, so we'll leave it as that. Require multi-factor authentication on active assignments. Again, if you need that to be added on, for now, we've only added it as and when they elevate themselves to be this role. They verify with MFA. Once they've done that, they're okay to carry on working. Again, depending on your needs, you might need to add that in here as well. Along with that, you can add notifications. There are quite a few different options over here that you can explore in your own time to look at, where we can define that if somebody was to assign this role to them, different options there to send notifications out to someone saying, hey, this person has just elevated their role and they're performing some task based on the justification you provide. Again, it could be something that a security team gets a notification and they look at it and they're okay with it. And again, it could be something that, hey, this user was away. Well, how is this happening? It could be an alarm for you to look at something malicious is going on. So again, notifications can be quite nice. And you can look at quite a few different options in here to explore, to assign or to work with notifications. Now, I will leave these settings out for now. I'm not changing my current settings. These are default settings that I have at the moment. Please bear in mind, if you make a change to this, this applies to every single role or every single person that is going to use this role. So it's not defined per person changes in terms of the activation time period and the request details that you create in here. So bear that in mind. Now let's come out of the role, and here we have the role assigned, and let's jump onto Frank's profile and see if Frank can go and request for this role and see on how that process looks like. Now, let me quickly jump onto the portal. This is where Frank is working with us. Now, earlier on in the session, we were looking at managing Frank's access and looking at Frank's applications. This time, we are going to jump onto entra.microsoft.com using Frank's profile, and we'll log in. All right, I'm logged back into Frank's account. Logged into Entra Admin Center using Frank's account. So what we'll do is we'll scroll down to Identity Governance and look at PIM, or Privileged Identity Management. And in here, I can see under Frank, you can see what roles Frank currently has. An application administrator role is available for Frank. Frank is eligible for this assignment. Currently, if I look at any active roles, none assigned to Frank. So if Frank wants to activate this, all Frank needs to do is click on activate. And we do have options to say, hey, the activation is typically 8 hours long. Do you need it for that long? Or I can say, you know what, I'm just going to be doing work for the next 1 hour, and I just need to be able to perform that for that time period. Now, I can do custom activation to start time. I can do that right now. So again, if I know I'm going to do this work and then in 10, 20 minutes later, not right now, maybe I can go into defining a delayed start time. Or I could just do that now and say, hey, start this now, give me 1 hour and I should be done with my work. And the reason for me to do this, creating, or actually let's do updating Registered app. Cool. Let's activate this. And this is the process of where Frank is assigning themselves or activating or elevating themselves to be an application administrator. All right, it took a few seconds and I can see that it's now activated. And if I go into this, I can see currently there's an activated role and it's assigned to Frank. And if I am done with this role, I can go and deactivate this at any time. Even though I initially requested this for 1 hour's activation, again, I have that control to make changes to this. Again, if I need to extend that, all I need to do is come back in here and activate it one more time, and I get that role assigned to myself again. Now, this is how you would manage typically PIM in your environment to assign roles in Entra. And again, a better way of controlling on who has access to what roles, should they be eligible for that rather than a permanent assignment, is a decision that you should consider and implement in your environment. Now, apart from that, apart from simply managing roles and assigning roles and making them eligible, we could also come down in here to have a look at other things. If you look at the alerts that we have, by default, it's got some details in here that it picks up from. I can go into my settings tab in here to enable some of these to say, hey, show me all of these. I want to see if any of these alerts are popping up in my environment. And this is a predefined setting that it can enable to see if they're active. And if you think, hey, there are too many global administrators, currently that's not active. So if I go into this, I can say, yes, enable this particular part, and I can make this active and define what's minimum, what's maximum. So I can define some of that in here. By the way, Microsoft does recommend around 5 different or up to 5 global administrator in a tenant. Obviously, if you have a need for more than that, that's completely different. But a recommendation is around 5. And not too many and not too less. So that's something good to understand. Now, again, nice to see that it can generate some alerts for you based on some of these settings. And if, for example, you have roles that do not require multi-factor authentication for activation, maybe you want to know more about that. Hey, this role can be activated at any time. It could be a risk for you. Or you could look at people who've got roles assigned to them and they're stale and they're not using them. Do they need these roles? Again, I can see a list of people that I have in here that I could simply go and remove them from these roles because they haven't used them in a while. So again, a nice way to look at some of this. I can dismiss this, I can fix this by simply going into clicking on fix, and it should remove these from remove their access from these roles as well. So it's a nice way of looking at different alerts that are built into the roles under the PIM for me. Now, apart from looking at these alerts and configuring some of these in here, we could also create access reviews. Now, in one of the previous videos, we speak about access reviews under entitlement management. We speak about access reviews on its own to look at access reviews for groups and apps. We can do access reviews on roles as well. And this is something that I can come in here to define, to see, hey, I want to create a new access review to make sure that the roles that we have in here, people don't hold them for too long, and if they're stale and they're not working with them, maybe you can remove them to improve security in our environment. We don't want people to have those roles just in case. The roles should be only assigned to someone as and when they need it, just as we do under least privileged access under Zero Trust. It is just enough access and just in time access. So we need to drill down to that by looking at the roles as well to ensure we don't have role assignment just added on for people for the sake of it. Or if it was done, do they still need it? And if we don't, we can remove some of that from there. Now, apart from looking at roles, what else can we look at in PIM? So if I jump back out to the main menu on PIM, we have something very similar for my groups as well over here. So we can start looking at managing groups in my setup to see, hey, if there are people that are a member of the groups, Do they need to be a member of this group? And again, we can see access reviews for this. However, we can control some of that in my PIM environment over here as well. Now, just to make sure, if you are looking at the list of your groups and you don't see all of them in here, and that's only because you haven't onboarded that group in here. So all you need to do is discover the groups from up here top, and you come down in here to see all the groups that you have in your environment that you haven't onboarded them as yet to the setup. Now, I have a security group that's not been onboarded as yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that and say, hey, let's onboard you to my setup in PIM. So not all the groups are going to be here. And you can't add dynamic groups to this as well, because if a group is dynamic, users can't request to be a member of that group, because that will only happen based on the syntax as defined for that dynamic group. So in this case, you can only have groups that are assigned. And again, if they're not onboarded, you have to go and onboard these groups. So I can simply click on the group that I want to onboard. We're bringing on security group for now, and we'll say manage this group. And it says, hey, are you sure you want to onboard this group to PIM? And I'll say, okay to that. We want to onboard that group to PIM. And hopefully we should see that group appearing up on the list any second. All right, seems like that group has been added. So security group is now visible. We can see it's been onboarded. We can see it's got 4 members. It doesn't have any owners. So if I go into security group here, I can see that currently there are no eligibilities in here. Current active assignments expired. So there's nothing currently added to this. So what I can do is I can start assigning roles as assignments to this group. Currently, it has 4 members already, so I can start looking at saying, hey, let's add a new assignment to this. And in this case, on the security group, we are going to give an owner role to Frank, and Frank can become an owner of this group as and when Frank needs, because this is going to be using PIM. So let's go and give Frank the owner role and make sure when Frank needs to do some tasks, Frank can add themselves to be a owner of this group. Right, and that's pretty much me defining the details on Frank. Again, we are going to leave this as eligible and not actively assigned. I don't want Frank to be always an owner of this group. I only want Frank to claim this as when Frank needs to go and manage this group, maybe add a member, remove a member, or do something around that. So for now, we'll just leave it as that. Right, so we can see Frank has now just been added to this, or this should be eligible for Frank. So if I go into the owners again one more time, currently there's no active assignments, but if I check the eligibility, Frank has the eligibility to assign themselves to be this role, or to be added as an owner to this particular group. Now, okay, cool, that's fine. We don't want to remove that. We'll leave it as it is. Now, just to go back and check this on Frank's profile, let's have a look at this. So if I go back into Frank's profile, all right, we're back into Frank's profile, and all I'm going to do is go into the groups and check if I can have access to these groups. So currently I can see there are 4 members, 1 owner of this group. And check this out. Currently, the owner eligibility is available for Frank to assign themselves. And again, same process. You can simply go and request to be activating this. Again, choosing the same process. Define the time you need. But I'm sure will be done in half an hour. I can say just adding a new user to the group. And that's something that Frank could be carrying out as a task, and hitting activation. And this is how Frank can activate to be the owner of the group. Now, I'll leave this happening. Let's jump back onto the portal where we were working with other resources. So let's go back in here. Again, this is just to talk about how we can manage entitlement management, privileged identity management for groups, rather than just looking at Entra roles. Now, this becomes very, very interesting. If you have groups that might have a particular role assigned to them, or a group that has a license assigned to it, A user that doesn't need to occupy that role or that license all the time could make this as an eligible group for them. And as and when they need it, they can go in and activate that, and they get access to that role or that license assigned to them. And as and when they leave, that role and that license gets removed from them. So this could be a nice way of planning out on different ways of implementing how you manage your licenses and roles in your environment. Not just a membership of a group, but also other things that come along with the group, where that group might be allowed to do certain things, or a role assignment that's implemented on that group. Now, apart from looking at just the groups, we can start looking at one last part that is available under PIM for us, which is looking at Azure Resources. Now, under Azure Resources, we have covered in this series a whole section on talking about Azure Resource roles and talking about RBAC, role-based access control under Identity and Access Management. So if you haven't seen that video, please have a look at that video to understand a little bit more detail around what the roles are, how you implement them, and what's the scope of assigning those. And in this part of the session, I'm going to take you through to a step that we can use some of that using PIM. So instead of me assigning someone a role permanently, we can look at managing all of that under PIM to make sure that role is available for someone, they're eligible to accept or apply that role to themselves as and when there's a need. So making that just in time access for them to be able to implement that role. Now, very quickly, what I'm going to do is assign myself to the scope of this particular setup to be my subscription that I have in my Azure environment. And from here, we are going to straight away jump into managing the resources under that subscription. Now, what this will show me is a list of all the roles that I currently have allowed or implemented in my environment. I can have a quick overview of the current roles to see, hey, how things are doing, what roles are assigned. 11 owners on different resources, some readers, some user access administrators. So you have quite a few different roles that I already have running in my environments. Again, I could go into checking as an individual user's view. I can see what roles I have assigned on myself. I can check as an admin to manage this environment because I am currently the administrator. However, for the end user, they probably won't see all these details there. Now, what can I do in terms of the roles over here? So if I go back into saying, hey, let's go manage some roles, and this is where it should bring me a long list of RBAC roles that are available for Azure for me to implement. For instance, as part of one of the sessions in this series, we've spoken about assigning somebody a, let's say, virtual machine admin login role. So if I want to assign that role, currently there is someone, Adele, that's already eligible for this role. Let's add an assignment for this and say we want to look at the virtual machine admin login. So I want a user to be able to log into a virtual machine with administrative rights, but they are going to authenticate themselves with their Entra ID, not using their virtual machines username and password. Now, if you want to know how to set all of this up, please make sure you watch one of my videos talking about this in this series, where we go and discuss identity manage identities and look at assigning some of that to your resources and configuring RBAC. Now, going back to this again, we are going to add a member to this. We are going to say, hey, let's give this option to Frank and say, hey, Frank, whenever you're ready to log into this machine, can you go and manage some of this stuff for me in there? So we can assign this to Frank and say, hey, Frank, you're now eligible. As and when you're ready to log into the machine, before you do, just make sure you go and make that RBAC Azure role eligible to yourself, and you assign it to yourself, and then you can work with that. Now, currently, I'm not going to make it active as usual. We'll leave it as eligible, and we'll go ahead and assign that. Now, this is where it should pop up in a minute to suggest, hey, we have a new entry. Frank is also now eligible to assign this role to themselves, and they should be able to work with that role. Now, if I step into Frank's profile one more time to see how that looks like. Now, if I take if I click onto Azure Resources, this is where I can see now Frank has also got that role assigned to them as a virtual machine administrator login. So whenever Frank is ready to go and log into that machine as an administrator, one of the key things Frank would need to do is obviously try and authenticate themselves to that machine. The authentication process will complete because of Entra. However, the access they need, the authorization part that they would need is based on this role. Without this role, they can be authenticated, but they won't be able to do anything into it unless there's an RBAC role assigned to them to be able to perform different tasks. And this is what proves their authorization level of what they are able to do. In this case, as an admin logging into that machine. So they would need to go and activate this first before they're connected to that machine. Now, this is, again, a very quick way of looking at how we can manage different Azure roles or RBAC roles in your under your PIM, just to make sure that we are not assigning these roles just because people are requesting to do that, or once they're assigned and they're permanently assigned forever, we want to get away with that to coming back into just-in-time role activation or access provided to people, and this is how you should be able to deal with that. Now, under my Azure roles as well, I still have options to look at alerts similar to what we had under my Entra roles. So you can have a look at that. Too many permanent owners assigned to a resource. I can see there's a resource that has 6 counts of permanent owners, 6 different permanent owners. Doesn't sound right. So maybe something I need to go into fixing. So I can always go back into that to find out where that is. And I can always go back and looking at the resource that has too many of those assigned into it. By all means, I can remove some of them. If they're stale, not doing much, again, we can go into settings over here to look at there are any other alerts that we can trigger. There are a couple of them that I haven't triggered yet. So we can, by all means, go back into looking at some other alerts that this generates for me. And I can manage some more details inside of that. Now, along with all of this, under every single menu that we've covered so far, there is always like an activity to look at under the resource audits, the activity logs, and my audits. Now, by all means, you can look at all of this under the monitoring. However, while we're in that in the PIM feature itself, we should be able to monitor this as we go along. I can always go back into the overall PIM menu to look at my audit history to see what has been happening in here. You can see the requester of someone. Again, this is me configuring some of these details as we went through the menu here. So you can see, hey, we have some of these details performed. So you can always go back and monitor some of these things. People who are making changes, people who are requesting things. So you can always go back and check, hey, in Azure resources, what's been applied. Frank went and was made eligible to that role under the groups. We should see Frank again as adding to the group. So again, we can see that here. And again, if I go back into the Entra roles, we can see some of the changes that we made earlier on around Frank's role, again, for being an application administrator. So again, you can track everything that's happening in here and audit steps on anyone that's performing under PIM. And you can do the same when you're looking at applying these roles into your environment on how people are using these tools and audit them as and when you require. And with that, we come to an end to this session. This concludes our session. We encourage you to review the reference modules, check your knowledge with the additional study materials, watch other videos in this course, or search out your next favorite topic on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.